about the market and the market's way of interacting with what goes on in the world. I thought I would try something a little bit different, which would be to talk to you about the regulatory regime parts of our group have to engage with. So I think the first thing to point out about regulation is not every jurisdiction is regulated. But it's important to work out that regulation actually affects every jurisdiction. And I think, the reality is that nobody can ignore regulation. The globalization of economies and the way that the market has joined itself together across different jurisdictions means that it's here to stay. I've been in the markets for over 35 years and I've been regulated for pretty much all the time that I've been in the market. And it's never been tougher, it's never been harder to regulate. So I would say, in the 37 odd years that I've been in the market, most of my background has been in foreign exchange, fixed income, commodities, and some derivatives. I've worked mainly for tier 1 institutions, banks, and so on. The last big institution I worked for was AIG Financial Products, which some of you may or may not know. But one thing that came out of my experience there after the financial crash was just how poor regulation was before in some areas and how it's developed after that event. So in the two roles that I have in the group, I am one of the directors and the CEO of EBC Financial Group in the UK and also EBC Financial Group in the Cayman. I've been specific about names and I'll explain that to you in a little bit in a sec. So if we look at the slide up here, we can see the world is full of different jurisdictions, but there is not one global regulator, and that's probably a good thing. So there's just too many jurisdictions, they have too much local nuance, and to be frank, they would probably spend more time arguing with each other than getting anything done. It would be very difficult to do that. But what we do have is we have a group of institutions that operate globally that oversee what's going on. So if we look at the slide up in front of us, we have the IMF, which is the International Monetary Fund. I would say these guys are primarily there to be a body that solves immediate governmental problems. They tend to go into regions and countries that have budgetary or economic problems, and they arrange bailouts and reorganization of the system. World Bank is very similar, except for they're really there to provide financing for infrastructure products and to help with creating governance in the region. Third one is the BIS, the Bank of International Settlements. I think probably the easiest way to describe the BIS is it's the central bank's bank. So everybody needs a banker. These guys act as a central bank's banker. The last one I chose was the FSB, which is the Financial Stability Board. These guys really came to prominence after the global crash in 2007. And these guys are primarily there to coordinate policy and regulation on a global scope. So I guess the next thing to think about is who are the main regulators? There are many, but I've chosen a handful of people I think are good for this conversation. So we have the SEC and the CFTC, which is in the US. These guys primarily are there to regulate the securities industry, stocks and shares, and the CFTC will be in charge of derivatives. And then if we look at the UK, we have two bodies. We have the PRA. These guys look after the big banks, the big institutions. And we also have the FCA, who look after all of the other financial market participants below the big guys. So next up you have ESMA, which is in Europe. Europeans like to do things differently, so they have one body that sits at the top and it devises the regulation for the local regulators underneath. Next is ASIC in Australia, which you'll probably be familiar with. They regulate all of financial activity in Australia. And the last one I chose was Cayman Islands because it's an offshore jurisdiction, which is slightly different. So CIMA is the regulatory body, and like ASIC, they're in charge of everything that goes on in the financial markets out there. I think it's important to understand that the regulatory environment has changed, it's moved on. So there were many jurisdictions that were of a lower quality than some of the ones that we mentioned. And these jurisdictions tended to attract people that didn't want to go through the hard work of being regulated somewhere that was better refined. I think since the financial crisis, this has been tightened up enormously. So the main jurisdictions have dragged up the poorer jurisdictions so that they comply on a much higher level. There's many ways to do that. So I think politically they've been pushed to do things in a better way. And also politically they influence the banking system so that the system is not as ready to accept badly regulated companies and badly regulated jurisdictions. I think the first question you should ask about anybody that's regulated is, what does it mean? And it's hard. It's very, very difficult to be regulated in a good regime these days. Most of the regulators have a rule book, and they are very, very strict about what they will and won't let firms that they regulate do. I would say the FCA is probably the hardest. They work on an 11 principle rule. So they have 11 sets of areas that they like to influence the overall effectiveness of each firm. These frames are there for financial stability, and they're also there to protect the consumer, the client. So the idea of all of the regulators is really to protect the consumer. So they don't mind about big banks and professional people, but they're very, very concerned about the retail traders. So if we look at where EBC is regulated, we're regulated in 3 jurisdictions, the UK, Australia, and the Cayman Islands. So I would say the FCA is the toughest one. It's probably one of the toughest ones in the world. They're considered the highest benchmark for people to be regulated in the financial industry. ASIC is another very well-regarded regulator. They have had a very difficult job in the last 20 years because the growth in APAC markets has meant many people have come to ASAP. And I think they've had to mature and change the way that they regulate considerably to where they were before. And then lastly, we have the Caymans, which is where we've recently been regulated. And I would say, having gone through that process, a lot of the regulatory process was very similar to the FCA. They have a wider remit with different breadth of industries, but it's very, very similar to the FCA. So I think to recap, the first line is very important. Not every jurisdiction is regulated, but every jurisdiction is affected by the regulation in the plan. I would say that although I'm in charge of 2 of the regulated companies, it doesn't mean that that's always the best option for every client. But for some clients that require, for instance, more leverage, or they require a wider scope of product, the offshore entity can be a good solution. I would say, if you're going to go that route, do your homework. Everybody that trades with any counterparty, do your homework and make sure that that counterparty is good for you. If you look at EBC Financial Group is regulated in 3 jurisdictions. We have offshore companies, and we are continuing to grow. When you look at EBC, you can see that we've taken the hard route, not the easy route. We have a full offering for any type of client that wants to interact with us. So I think to conclude, I would say, if you're looking to deal with somebody, always check. Always do your homework and always choose carefully. It's very important that you as a client are happy and you're comfortable with the firm that you're dealing with. That's it from me. You'll now have something much more entertaining about the markets from Joe, but thank you for your time. My pleasure.